It started with a key, a simple brass key that didn't fit any of the locks in our house. I found it by accident one Friday evening when I came home from work and dumped my briefcase on the kitchen table. Karen, my wife of 32 years, wasn't home yet. She'd been out more often these days, book clubs, volunteering at the local charity shop, meeting old friends for coffee. At least that's what she told me. The key was lying in the bottom of her purse, which she had left open on the kitchen counter, half covered by a shopping receipt and some loose change. It caught my eye immediately because I knew it wasn't one of ours. I stood there for a moment, staring at it, trying to place where it could be from. It wasn't the kind of thing Karen would keep around without a reason, so I pulled it out, held it in my palm, and stared at it as if it might magically reveal its purpose. That's when the doubt crept in. I hadn't thought much about Karen's increasing absences until that moment. We were both in our late 50s, retired, with the kids long gone. The house had grown quiet, almost too quiet sometimes. We had settled into a routine that felt comfortable, predictable. I thought we were just living the natural progression of a long marriage. But as I stood there holding the key, a different thought began to take root, a darker one. I wanted to dismiss it. I wanted to believe there was a simple explanation, that Karen had probably borrowed a key from someone at the charity shop or found it somewhere. But the more I turned it over in my hand, the more I felt something nagging at me. Something wasn't right. When Karen came home later that evening, she was her usual self, smiling, cheerful, asking me about my day. She kissed me on the cheek, went on about how she had run into an old friend at the cafe, and I tried to act normal. But the key was burning a hole in my pocket, and the suspicion I had tried to ignore was now gnawing at me with every word she said. That night, I didn't bring it up. Instead, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling while Karen slept soundly beside me. My mind raced, turning over every recent memory, every little detail I might have missed. Was she really just going to book clubs and meeting friends? Or had something else been going on all this time right under my nose? The next day, I did something I had never done in our entire marriage. I followed her. It felt ridiculous at first, like I was some character in a bad detective novel, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed answers. That key had unlocked more than just my curiosity. It had opened a door to doubts I hadn't allowed myself to explore. And once those doubts were there, I couldn't close that door. Karen left the house around noon, telling me she was heading to her book club as usual. I waited a few minutes after she drove off, before getting into my car and following at a safe distance. I felt a strange mix of guilt and adrenaline. This was something I never imagined myself doing, spying on my own wife. But the thought of not knowing was worse than the guilt I felt. She didn't go to the book club. I followed her as she drove across town, taking a route I didn't recognize. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched her turn down a narrow street lined with old apartment buildings, the kind of place we never had any reason to visit. She parked outside one of the buildings and got out of the car, glancing around as if checking to make sure no one had followed her. Then, she took the key from her purse. I watched from a distance as Karen walked up to the front door of the apartment building, unlocked it with that same brass key, and disappeared inside. I sat there in my car, staring at the entrance, my mind racing. She had lied. Whatever she was doing, it wasn't a book club. And that key, it wasn't just something she had borrowed or found by accident. It belonged here to this place. I waited. 10 minutes, 15, 20. My mind spun with possibilities, each one worse than the last. Was she meeting someone? How long had this been going on? And why hadn't I seen the signs sooner? After nearly an hour, I saw her come back out, adjusting her coat as she hurried back to the car. I ducked down, not wanting her to see me, even though she didn't seem to be looking around this time. She got into the car and drove off, and I sat there for a long time, processing what I had just seen. The woman I had shared my life with for over 3 decades had secrets, big ones. And I wasn't sure I was ready to find out what they were. I drove home in a daze, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. Karen had lied. She'd been going to that apartment instead of her book club, and that brass key, the one I'd found in her purse, fit the lock. My stomach twisted as the implications began to settle in, each scenario worse than the last. Was she meeting someone? How long had she been sneaking off like this? By the time I pulled into the driveway, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the lawn. I sat in the car for a few minutes, trying to figure out what I should do next. Confront her? Demand answers? Or should I wait? Try to gather more information? Make sure I wasn't jumping to conclusions. But what other conclusion could there be? I walked into the house feeling like an intruder in my own life. Karen was in the kitchen, humming to herself as she prepared dinner. The smell of roasting chicken filled the air, and for a brief moment, everything looked normal. This was our routine after all. I came home, she cooked dinner, we talked about our day, and life moved on as it always had. But now it all felt like a performance. "There you are," Karen said, glancing up with a smile. "I thought you were going to be late." I forced a smile, my heart pounding. "Yeah, traffic was lighter than I thought." She nodded and turned back to the stove, stirring something in a pot. I stood there watching her, trying to reconcile the woman in front of me with the one who had just been sneaking around in some stranger's apartment. For 32 years, I had trusted her implicitly. I never questioned where she went, who she was with, but now, everything seemed different, shrouded in doubt. "How was your book club?" I asked, casually. My voice a little too tight. Karen didn't miss a beat. "Oh, it was good. We're reading that new historical novel I told you about. It's a little slow, but the discussion was great. Mary brought these amazing homemade cookies. I'll have to get the recipe." She was lying. I could hear it in her voice. The practiced ease of someone who had told the same lie more than once. My chest tightened with a mixture of anger and sadness. How long had she been doing this? How many times had she stood there smiling and making dinner while keeping secrets from me? I sat down at the kitchen table, watching her move around the kitchen, my mind spinning with questions I wasn't ready to ask. "You seem quiet," Karen said after a few moments, glancing over at me. "Everything okay?" I swallowed hard, trying to push down the anger that was bubbling up inside me. "Yeah," I lied. "Just tired, long day." She gave me a sympathetic smile, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Dinner's almost ready. Why don't you relax for a bit? I'll bring it to the table in a few minutes." I nodded, my throat tight, and got up to leave the kitchen. As I walked down the hallway toward our bedroom, I felt like a stranger in my own home. Every picture on the wall, every piece of furniture, every memory we had built together, it all felt tainted now, overshadowed by the secret Karen was hiding. In the bedroom, I sat down on the edge of the bed, staring at the framed photos on the dresser. One of them was from our anniversary trip to Italy a few years ago. We looked so happy, standing in front of some ancient ruins, smiling at the camera like we didn't have a care in the world. I picked up the frame, studying our faces, trying to understand how we had gone from that to this. How had I missed the signs? Or had there been no signs at all? That night, we ate dinner in near silence. Karen made small talk, asking about my day, but I barely responded, too caught up in my thoughts. She seemed to sense that something was off, but she didn't press. Instead, she cleared the plates after dinner and headed upstairs to shower, leaving me alone at the table with my swirling thoughts. As soon as she was out of sight, I found myself moving toward her purse again, the need for answers overpowering the guilt I felt for invading her privacy. I reached inside, fingers trembling, and pulled out her phone. I'd never gone through Karen's phone before. We always respected each other's space, but this wasn't about respect anymore. This was about finding out the truth. I scrolled through her recent calls, nothing out of the ordinary. A few missed calls from friends I recognized, a couple of numbers that looked like telemarketers. Then I checked her messages. My heart pounded as I scrolled, finding mostly mundane conversations. There were texts from our kids, some old messages from friends, and reminders from the doctor's office. But then I saw a name I didn't recognize. Avery. There was no last name, no picture, just a first name. My pulse quickened as I opened the thread. The most recent message was from that afternoon. "Same time next week?" And Karen's reply, "Yes, I'll bring the key." I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin as I stared at the screen. Avery. Was that who she was meeting at the apartment? I scrolled back through the messages, looking for more clues, but the conversation was frustratingly vague. There were no details about who Avery was or what exactly they were meeting for. But it was clear that this had been going on for a while, long enough for them to have a routine. My hands shook as I put the phone back in her purse, my mind racing with possibilities. Who was Avery? Was it a man? A woman? What was the key for? And why had she lied to me about the book club? By the time Karen came downstairs, I was sitting in the living room trying to look as if I hadn't just invaded her privacy and found proof of something much worse than I had imagined. "I'm going to bed," she said softly, her hair still damp from the shower. "You coming?" I nodded, my stomach in knots. "Yeah, I'll be up in a minute." She gave me a small smile and disappeared up the stairs. I waited until I heard the bedroom door close before standing up, my mind still reeling. I didn't know what I was going to do next. I didn't have a plan, but one thing was clear. Karen wasn't who I thought she was, and whatever she had gotten herself involved in, I wasn't sure our marriage would survive it. The next morning, I woke up feeling the weight of everything pressing down on me. Karen was already up, making breakfast downstairs, moving around the kitchen as if nothing had changed. But for me, everything had. The messages, the key, the apartment, those weren't things I could ignore, no matter how much I wanted to. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering how long this had been going on. How had I been so blind? 32 years of marriage, and now it felt like I didn't know the woman I'd shared my life with. Avery. Who was Avery? That name burned in my mind. The vagueness of the messages made it worse. There was no clarity, no answers, just more questions. And the key that opened the door to an apartment where she had been going behind my back. I felt sick thinking about what else that key might open. I couldn't stay in bed any longer. I needed to confront this head on. Karen was hiding something, and I wasn't going to let it continue. But I wasn't ready to burst into the kitchen and demand answers. Not yet. I needed to know more before I went down that road. When I walked downstairs, Karen was already sitting at the table, sipping her coffee and reading the newspaper like she did every morning. She glanced up when she saw me and smiled, but I could feel a strange tension between us. Something had shifted, even if she didn't know it yet. "Morning," she said, setting her mug down. "There's some eggs on the stove if you're hungry." "Thanks," I muttered, pouring myself a cup of coffee. I stood there for a moment, watching her, trying to see if there was any hint of guilt in her expression, anything that would tell me she was hiding something. But Karen had always been good at keeping a calm exterior. If she felt any guilt, she didn't show it. I sat down across from her, sipping my coffee, trying to act as if everything was normal. But I couldn't shake the image of her walking into that apartment with the key in her hand. I couldn't forget the name Avery flashing across her phone, the casual way she had agreed to meet again. "You're quiet," Karen said, raising an eyebrow. "Everything okay?" I forced a smile. "Yeah, just thinking about some things." She didn't press, which was unusual. Normally, Karen would have probed further, asking what was on my mind, trying to connect with me. But not today. Today, she seemed distant. Or maybe it was just me. Maybe knowing what I knew now had made me more aware of every little detail, every small interaction between us. After breakfast, I grabbed my keys and headed for the door. "I've got a few errands to run," I called over my shoulder. Karen looked up from her newspaper, a little surprised. "Errands? On a Saturday? That's not like you." I shrugged, trying to keep my voice casual. "Just a couple of things I need to pick up." She smiled, and for a moment I could almost believe everything was fine. Almost. "All right, don't be gone too long. I thought we could take a walk later. It's supposed to be nice out." I nodded, not committing to anything. "We'll see." As soon as I was out the door, the weight of the situation hit me again. I wasn't just running errands. I was going to that apartment. I needed to know what was behind that door. I needed to see for myself what Karen had been hiding from me. The drive across town felt longer than it had the day before. My heart pounded in my chest, a mixture of adrenaline and dread coursing through me. What was I going to find? Was she meeting someone there? Was it just an affair, or was there something else? The uncertainty was eating me alive. When I pulled up to the apartment building, it looked just as nondescript as it had the first time. An old brick building with faded shutters and a few potted plants on the balconies. Nothing about it screamed secret, but that's what made it worse. How ordinary it looked, how easily something like this could hide in plain sight. I parked a block away, not wanting to draw attention to myself, and walked up to the building, my heart racing. I stood in front of the door for a moment, the brass key heavy in my pocket, the same key Karen had used. My fingers trembled as I pulled it out, staring at it for a moment before sliding it into the lock. It fit perfectly. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should really be doing this. If I went through that door, I might never be able to unsee what I found. But I needed to know. I needed the truth, even if it hurt. I turned the key and the door clicked open with a soft creak. I stepped inside, the dim hallway stretching out in front of me. The air was stale, like the place hadn't been aired out in days. My footsteps echoed slightly as I moved down the hall, my pulse pounding in my ears. There were 3 doors in the hallway, 2 on the left, 1 on the right. I didn't know which one was hers. I stood there for a moment, listening for any sound, but the building was quiet, too quiet. I took a deep breath and chose the door on the right, the one I had seen her enter the day before. I knocked, my knuckles rapping softly against the wood. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. The tension in my chest grew as I glanced around, wondering if I was making a huge mistake. What if someone else opened it? What if I was wrong about everything? But before I could turn away, I reached for the doorknob and twisted it. It wasn't locked. I pushed the door open, my breath catching in my throat as I stepped inside. The apartment was small, just a one-bedroom with basic furniture. It didn't look lived in, not really. There were no personal touches, no photos, no signs of a long-term tenant. Just a couch, a coffee table, and a small kitchen with barely any dishes on the counter. It was almost empty. I stood in the doorway, my mind racing. Why would Karen come here? What was this place to her? I moved deeper into the apartment, my eyes scanning the room for any clues. There was a faint smell in the air, something sweet, like perfume, but it wasn't Karen's. As I walked into the living room, I spotted something on the coffee table that stopped me in my tracks. A notebook, open to a page with scribbled writing. I picked it up, my hands trembling as I read the words. I don't know how much longer I can keep this up. Every time I'm with him, I feel the weight of what I'm doing, but I can't stop. I think about Avery, and I stopped reading, my stomach lurching. The words blurred in front of me as the reality of the situation hit me like a tidal wave. This wasn't just an affair. This was something deeper, something more complicated than I had ever imagined. I dropped the notebook back on the table, my heart racing. Whoever Avery was, they were at the center of this. And whatever Karen was hiding, it went far beyond what I had expected. I turned to leave, my mind spinning with questions. But just as I reached the door, I heard footsteps outside. My heart leapt into my throat as I froze, listening. Someone was coming. And then, before I could react, the door swung open. The door swung open, and I barely had time to react before I came face to face with a woman I didn't recognize. She froze in the doorway, her hands still on the knob, her eyes widening in shock as she saw me standing in the middle of the room. For a few seconds, we just stared at each other, the air between us thick with confusion and tension. She was in her late 40s, I guessed. Dark hair pulled back into a loose ponytail, wearing casual clothes. But what stood out most was the way her face mirrored my own shock. Whoever she wasn't expecting me to be here. "Who the hell are you?" she finally asked, her voice sharp but shaky. I didn't answer right away. My heart was still racing, and I was trying to piece together what was happening. This wasn't Karen. This wasn't anyone I had ever seen before. But why did she have a key to the same apartment Karen had been sneaking into? "I could ask you the same thing," I shot back, my voice firmer than I felt. "What are you doing here?" The woman's eyes narrowed, and she stepped further into the room, letting the door swing shut behind her. "I think I'm the one who's supposed to be asking that. This is my place." "Her place?" I blinked, my mind reeling. If this was her apartment, then why had Karen been coming here? And who was Avery? I hesitated, unsure of how much to say. "I'm looking for answers. My wife has been coming here, and I need to know why." The woman's expression changed instantly. Her shoulders slumped slightly, and for the first time I saw a flash of recognition in her eyes. She knew exactly what I was talking about. She took a deep breath, walking past me toward the kitchen counter where she set down her bag. Her movements were slow, careful, like she was trying to gather her thoughts before responding. "I was wondering when someone would come looking for answers," she muttered, more to herself than to me. I took a step closer, my confusion deepening. "Who are you?" She turned to face me, her expression softening just a little. "My name's Evelyn, and I think we need to talk." "Talk?" I echoed, incredulous. "About what? Why my wife has been sneaking off to your apartment? Who the hell is Avery?" At the mention of the name, Evelyn winced, her eyes flicking away from mine. There was a tension in the air now, something that told me whatever she was about to say wasn't going to be easy to hear. She sighed heavily, crossing her arms as she leaned against the counter. "Avery is my daughter," she said quietly, her voice tinged with a sadness that seemed to seep into the room. I stared at her, my mind spinning. Her daughter? None of this was making any sense. Why would Karen be involved with some stranger's daughter? What did any of this have to do with the affair I had suspected? "I don't understand," I said, shaking my head. "What does your daughter have to do with my wife?" Evelyn hesitated for a moment before speaking again. She's Karen's daughter, too." I froze. The words didn't compute at first, like my brain couldn't process what she had just said. "Karen's daughter? What was she talking about?" "I'm sorry," I said, my voice slow, deliberate. "Karen doesn't have another daughter. We've been married for 32 years. We have 2 kids, both grown." "What are you saying?" Evelyn's expression softened, her eyes filled with sympathy, and I realized she wasn't lying. She wasn't playing some cruel game. This was real. "You don't know, do you?" she asked softly. "You don't know about Avery?" I shook my head, still trying to wrap my mind around what she was saying. "Karen never mentioned anyone named Avery. I don't—" Evelyn interrupted me gently. "Avery is from before you and Karen met. She gave her up for adoption. My husband and I, We adopted her when she was a baby. The room started spinning and I felt like I couldn't breathe. I grabbed the back of the nearest chair to steady myself, my thoughts racing so fast I couldn't keep up with them. Karen had another daughter, a child she had never told me about, and this woman, Evelyn, had raised her? How is this possible? I managed to ask, my voice hoarse. Karen never said anything about this, not once. Evelyn nodded, understanding the shock that was written all over my face. She didn't think she'd ever see Avery again. That was part of the agreement when she gave her up for adoption. It was a closed adoption, but a few months ago, Avery reached out. She wanted to meet Karen, to understand where she came from. That's why Karen has been coming here. She's been meeting with Avery. I felt like I had been punched in the gut. For all these weeks, I had assumed Karen was having an affair. I had imagined the worst possible scenarios, only to find out that it wasn't some illicit relationship at all. It was something else, something far more complicated and heartbreaking. I slumped down into the chair, my mind reeling from the revelation. Karen had a secret child, a daughter she had never mentioned in the 3 decades we had been together. All the lies, all the secrecy. It had been to protect this part of her past that she had buried. Evelyn sat down across from me, her expression soft but serious. I know this is a lot to take in. Avery wanted to keep things private. She didn't want to disrupt your life, but Karen, she couldn't keep it from her. I think it's been weighing on her ever since. I swallowed hard, trying to find my voice. Why didn't Karen tell me? Evelyn sighed. She was afraid. She didn't know how to tell you after all these years. And once Avery reached out, it all happened so fast. I think she thought it would be easier to handle on her own, without dragging you into it. I felt a surge of anger. Easier to handle on her own? How could she think that keeping something like this from me, something this monumental, was a solution? We were supposed to be partners. We had built a life together, a family, and now it felt like I had been living a lie. But beneath the anger, there was something else. Sadness. Sadness for Karen, for the weight of the secret she had been carrying all this time. And sadness for Avery, this daughter I had never known existed, whose very existence had been kept hidden from me. I stood up, pacing the room as my thoughts continued to spin. I don't know how to process this, I admitted, my voice strained. She's been lying to me for weeks, months. Why didn't she just tell me? Evelyn looked at me with understanding. Secrets like this, they get heavier over time. Karen probably thought she could manage it, but once she started meeting Avery, the guilt must have been overwhelming. I'm not defending her actions, but I can see why she struggled. I stopped pacing, turning to face her. Where is Avery now? Evelyn glanced toward the bedroom door. She's here. She's been staying with me while she figures things out. If you want to meet her, I can ask her to come out. I hesitated, my mind still spinning. I wasn't sure if I was ready for that, to meet this person who had been at the center of everything. This person I hadn't even known existed until minutes ago. But a part of me knew I had to. I had to see her, to understand what had brought us to this point. Okay, I said finally, my voice quiet. I'll meet her. Evelyn nodded and stood up, walking toward the bedroom door. My heart pounded as I watched her disappear down the hall, my thoughts a blur of confusion, anger, and anticipation. A few moments later, I heard soft footsteps approaching. I stood there, bracing myself for what was about to happen. And then, Avery stepped into the room. She was young, in her mid-20s, with Karen's eyes. The resemblance was undeniable, and it hit me like a punch to the gut. This was Karen's daughter, the daughter she had never told me about. And now, she was standing in front of me. Avery stood there in the doorway, her posture tense, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and curiosity. I could see Karen in her immediately, the same shade of dark brown hair, the same way her eyebrows arched when she was nervous. But there was something different too, something more guarded. I couldn't blame her. I felt the same way. For a few seconds, we just stared at each other, both of us unsure of what to say. It was as if time had slowed down, and the weight of what was happening pressed on my chest, making it hard to breathe. This young woman in front of me was my wife's daughter, a part of her life that had been hidden from me for 3 decades. And now, here she was, standing in front of me like a secret that had finally come to light. Evelyn stood behind her, watching us both carefully. Avery, she said softly, placing a gentle hand on her daughter's shoulder. This is Phil, Karen's husband. Avery's eyes flickered, searching my face for something. Recognition, maybe. She nodded slightly, taking a step further into the room. Hi, she said, her voice small and unsure. I don't know what to say. Neither did I. What do you say to the daughter your wife never told you about? I cleared my throat, trying to find my voice. I didn't know. I didn't know you existed until today, I said quietly, the words feeling strange in my mouth. Karen never told me. Avery's face softened, and for a moment she looked as lost as I felt. She didn't tell anyone, she said. Not until I found her. I I wanted to know where I came from. Her words hit me harder than I expected. Of course she would want to know. I couldn't imagine what it must have been like for her, growing up knowing that she had been given up for adoption, wondering who her biological mother was. But hearing it from her own mouth made it real in a way that nothing else had. I nodded, unsure of how to respond. How long have you and Karen been in contact? Avery shifted her weight, glancing down at the floor before answering. A few months. I found her through the adoption records, and I reached out. At first, she didn't want to meet. She said it was too complicated. She paused, biting her lip. But then she changed her mind. I could imagine Karen struggling with that decision, the guilt eating away at her, not knowing how to reconcile her past with the life she had built with me. The thought of her dealing with all of that on her own without telling me sent another wave of anger surging through me. But at the same time, I couldn't help but feel for Avery. She'd been caught in the middle of this, trying to find answers to questions she had probably carried her whole life. And that's why she's been coming here, I said, more to myself than to anyone else. Avery nodded. Yeah, we meet here because, well, I didn't want to complicate her life. I didn't want to cause problems for her and you. A bitter laugh escaped my lips before I could stop it. Well, it's a little late for that. Evelyn shot me a look, but Avery didn't flinch. If anything, she looked more guilty than ever. I'm sorry, she said, her voice trembling. I didn't mean for this to happen. I just wanted to know where I came from. I stared at her, my emotions swirling in a mess of confusion and anger, but also empathy. Avery was just trying to make sense of her past, trying to understand who she was. And Karen, for all the lies and secrecy, had been trying to protect us both from the fallout of something she probably never thought she'd have to face again. I don't blame you, I said, my voice softening. It's just a lot to take in. Avery nodded, her eyes meeting mine. I know. It's a lot for me, too. We stood there in silence for a few moments, the weight of everything hanging between us. It felt surreal. This moment, this room, the woman standing in front of me who had been a part of my wife's past that I had never known about. I wasn't sure if I was ready to deal with all of this, but I didn't have much of a choice. The truth was out now, and there was no going back. Finally, Evelyn spoke, her voice quiet but firm. Phil, I think you need to talk to Karen. She's been carrying this burden for a long time, and I know it's not easy for you, but she deserves the chance to explain. She was right. As much as I wanted to avoid it, to leave this place and never look back, I knew I had to confront Karen. She had kept this from me for so long, and now that I knew the truth, there was no avoiding the conversation we needed to have. I'll talk to her, I said, my voice sounding distant even to my own ears. But I don't know what's going to happen after that. Avery nodded, her eyes filled with a sadness that mirrored my own. I understand. I turned to leave, the weight of everything I had learned pressing down on me like a physical burden. But just as I reached the door, I stopped and looked back at Avery. She was standing there looking small and uncertain, a stranger, but also someone connected to the woman I had spent my life with. Are you going to keep seeing her? I asked, unsure of what the answer would mean for me. Avery hesitated, glancing at Evelyn for a moment before looking back at me. I want to, she said softly. But that's up to Karen now, and up to you. Her words hung in the air, and I realized that this wasn't just about Karen and Avery. It was about me too. My reaction, my willingness to accept what had happened would shape the future of all of this, whether or not we could move forward as a family, even if that family looked different than I had ever imagined. I nodded, not trusting myself to say anything more. I wasn't ready to make any decisions, not yet, but I knew that the conversation with Karen would be the first step in figuring out what came next. I left the apartment, my mind spinning with everything that had been revealed. The drive home felt longer than it should have, my thoughts racing ahead of me. I wasn't sure what I was going to say to Karen. I wasn't even sure how I felt anymore. About her, about our marriage, about the secrets she had kept from me. But when I pulled into the driveway and saw her car parked outside, I knew there was no turning back. It was time to face the truth, no matter how painful it was. I walked into the house, and there she was, sitting on the couch, her hands folded in her lap, waiting. She looked up when she heard the door open, her eyes wide with fear, as if she knew exactly where I had been and what I had found out. Phil, she said softly, standing up, we need to talk. For once I agreed. Karen stood there, her face pale, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and resignation. She knew exactly what I had found out, and now there was no point in pretending anymore. The weight of all the lies, the secrets she had been carrying for decades was written all over her face. For a moment, I just stood in the doorway, taking in the woman I had been married to for 32 years. The woman I thought I knew inside and out. But now standing here, she felt like a stranger. I went to the apartment, I said, my voice tight. I know about Avery. Karen's face crumpled. Her shoulders slumped as if the air had been knocked out of her, and she lowered her gaze, unable to meet my eyes. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I should have told you. I just didn't know how. 32 years, I said, my voice rising with the anger I'd been holding in for days. How do you keep something like this from me for that long? How do you live with it? Tears filled her eyes as she stepped closer, but I took a step back, keeping the distance between us. I didn't trust myself to get any closer, not yet. Phil, please, she begged, her voice trembling. It wasn't something I planned to hide forever. It became part of the past, and I didn't want it to disrupt our lives. Our lives, I shot back, incredulous. Karen, this is part of your life, part of who you are, and you just erased it like it didn't matter? She shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. No, I didn't erase it. I didn't think it would ever come back. When I gave Avery up for adoption, it was one of the hardest things I've ever done. I was young, scared, and I didn't have any support. I didn't think I'd ever see her again, and then you and I met and we started a life together. I thought it was in the past. I could see the pain in her eyes, the regret, but it wasn't enough to calm the storm of emotions inside me. But it wasn't in the past, I said, my voice thick with frustration. You've been meeting her for months. Months, Karen, behind my back. You could have told me at any time, but you chose not to. I didn't know how, she cried, her voice breaking. How was I supposed to tell you after all these years? After we built a life together, raised our kids, I didn't know how to bring it up without destroying everything. Well, congratulations, I said bitterly. You managed to destroy everything anyway. She flinched at my words, and for a moment I regretted the harshness of them. But then I remembered all the lies, all the times she had gone to that apartment, keeping me in the dark. I wasn't ready to forgive her, not yet. I was going to tell you, Karen said, wiping her eyes. I swear, I was. I just didn't know when. Avery reaching out brought up so many emotions I hadn't dealt with in years. I didn't know how to face it, let alone bring you into it. I felt my hands clench into fists at my sides, the frustration boiling over. You should have let me in, Karen. You should have trusted me enough to tell me the truth. I've been your husband for 3 decades. How could you think I wouldn't understand? I was scared, she whispered. Scared that you'd hate me, that you'd leave me. I shook my head, pacing the room. I don't know what to think. I don't know how to feel about any of this. You've been keeping a whole part of your life from me, and I'm supposed to just understand. Karen stood there, silent, her face crumpled with guilt. I could see that she was struggling, but I wasn't sure if I could handle the weight of everything she had been hiding. My mind was racing, trying to piece together the woman I thought I knew with the woman standing in front of me now, the woman who had been living with a secret for over 30 years. What else haven't you told me? I asked suddenly, the question slipping out before I could stop it. Is there anything else I should know about? Karen's eyes widened, her expression one of desperation. No, Phil, I swear. Avery is the only secret I've ever kept from you. I know it's a big one, but there's nothing else. I've been faithful to you. I've never lied about anything else. Please, you have to believe me. I stared at her, my heart pounding in my chest. There was a part of me that wanted to believe her, that wanted to trust that this was the only lie she had ever told. But there was another part of me, the part that had been blindsided by her secrecy, that wasn't sure I could trust anything she said anymore. I don't know if I can believe you, I said quietly, my voice shaking. You've been lying to me for so long. Before, how am I supposed to just take your word for it now? Karen let out a sob, covering her face with her hands as she broke down in front of me. I'm so sorry, she cried. I never meant for any of this to happen. I just didn't know how to deal with it. Please, Phil, please don't hate me. I looked away, my chest tightening with the weight of her words. I didn't hate her. That was the problem. I was angry, hurt, betrayed, but I didn't hate her. I still loved her. That was what made all of this so much harder. I need time, I said finally, my voice thick with emotion. I need time to figure this out. Karen nodded, her face still wet with tears. Take as much time as you need. I'll do anything, Phil. Anything to make this right. I didn't respond. I couldn't. Instead, I walked out of the living room, needing space to breathe, space to think. I didn't know what to do, didn't know how to process everything that had happened in the last few days. I went upstairs to the guest room, the room I had been sleeping in ever since this whole thing had started. The bed was neatly made, the room quiet and still. I sat down on the edge of the bed, my head in my hands, trying to make sense of the mess my life had become. I thought about Avery, about how she had been searching for answers, for a connection to her past. I thought about Evelyn, raising Karen's daughter, unknowingly carrying a piece of Karen's life that I had never known about. And I thought about Karen herself, the woman I had loved for more than 3 decades, the woman who had been keeping this secret buried deep inside her for so long. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to forgive her, to try and rebuild the trust we had lost. But another part of me wasn't sure if I could move past this. The betrayal cut deep, and I wasn't sure if time would be enough to heal the wound. As I sat there staring at the floor, I realized that no matter what I decided, nothing would ever be the same again. The life I had known, the marriage I had trusted, had been forever changed by the secrets Karen had kept. The only question now was whether we could find a way forward, together. The days after my conversation with Karen were quiet, too quiet. We barely spoke, each of us retreating into our own corners of the house, trying to process the gravity of what had happened. Karen, for her part, gave me space, but I could see the weight of guilt in every look she gave me, in every tentative movement around the house. I knew she wanted to talk, to explain, to plead for forgiveness, but I wasn't ready. I needed time to think, to figure out if I could live with what she had kept from me for so long. That it wasn't just the secret of Avery, it was the betrayal of trust. 32 years of marriage, and she hadn't trusted me enough to let me in on this part of her life. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was a version of Karen I had never known, a version that had lived in the shadows of our relationship, hidden from view. And now, with Avery back in her life, that hidden part had come crashing into mine, shattering the life I thought we had. The truth was, I didn't know if we could move past this. One evening, about a week after our confrontation, I found myself sitting in the guest room again, staring out the window as the sun set behind the trees. I had spent so much time in this room lately, trying to figure out what to do, but no clear answers had come. The weight of indecision was heavy, and I knew that I couldn't keep living in this limbo forever. I had to make a choice. Just then, I heard a soft knock on the door. It was Karen. "Phil?" Her voice was quiet, hesitant. "Can I come in?" I didn't respond immediately, but after a moment I nodded, motioning for her to enter. She stepped inside, her face etched with sadness and anxiety, and sat down in the chair across from me, her hands trembling slightly in her lap. "I know you need time," she began, her voice thick with emotion. "And I know I hurt you in a way that I can never fully make up for. But I need to know where we stand. I need to know if there's any hope for us." I sighed, running a hand through my hair, trying to find the right words. "Karen, I've been trying to figure that out myself. I don't know. This isn't something I can just move past overnight." She nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "I understand. I don't expect you to. But I love you, Phil. I always have. And I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make this right. I'll go to counseling. I'll be as open as you need me to be. I'll do anything. I just need to know if there's a chance." There was a rawness in her voice that cut through my anger, my frustration. I could see how broken she was, how much this secret had weighed on her all these years. And I realized that I wasn't the only one who had been hurting. Karen had been carrying this burden for decades, the guilt of giving up a child, the fear of being judged, the agony of keeping it from me. She had made a terrible decision to hide it, but that decision had come from a place of deep pain. "I don't hate you," I said, my voice softer now. "I'm angry, I'm hurt, but I don't hate you. I still love you. That's what makes this so hard." Her eyes filled with hope, but she didn't speak, waiting for me to continue. "I don't know if I can fully forgive you yet," I admitted, "but I'm willing to try. I'm willing to see if we can rebuild this, piece by piece. It's going to take time, and it's going to take work. But I think we owe it to ourselves, and to our family, to try." Karen let out a soft sob, covering her mouth with her hand, her tears spilling over. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Thank you, Phil. I'll do anything. I'll prove to you that you can trust me again." I nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and apprehension. This wasn't going to be easy, and I knew that. But deep down, I knew that walking away from Karen after all these years would be harder. We had built a life together, shared memories, raised children, and now, with Avery in the picture, there was a chance for something new, something unexpected, but maybe even healing. "We'll take it one day at a time," I said quietly. "But we need to be honest with each other, Karen. No more secrets, no more hiding." She nodded eagerly, wiping her tears. "I promise, no more secrets." The conversation shifted after that. We didn't talk about Avery or the past in detail. There would be time for that later. Instead, we talked about how we would move forward. Counseling was the first step, a chance for us to work through the trust issues and the pain that had built up between us. Karen agreed to see a therapist on her own as well, to help her deal with the emotions she had buried for so long. A few days later, I called Avery, The conversation was awkward at first, both of us unsure of how to navigate this strange new dynamic, but I could hear the gratitude in her voice when I told her that Karen and I were going to work on our marriage, that we were trying to move forward. She didn't push for anything more, but I could tell she was relieved. There was a part of her that wanted to be part of Karen's life, part of our life, and I wasn't ready to deny her that. Over the next few weeks, Karen and I began the slow process of rebuilding. Counseling sessions were difficult, but they forced us to confront the deeper issues that had led to the secrecy in the first place. Karen opened up more about her feelings of guilt and shame, about the fear of losing me if I ever found out about Avery. I opened up about the betrayal I had felt, about how hard it was to trust her again. It wasn't easy, but for the first time in a long time, we were truly communicating. And then there was Avery. Slowly, we began to integrate her into our lives, cautiously at first. Karen and Avery continued to meet, but now, I was part of those meetings too. We didn't rush things, but we allowed ourselves the time to get to know each other. Avery was kind, thoughtful, and patient, everything I had hoped she would be. She wasn't trying to replace the family Karen and I had built, but she wanted to be part of it in her own way. It took months. But little by little, the anger began to fade. The trust wasn't fully back yet, but it was growing. Karen kept her promises, no more secrets, no more lies, and in return, I found myself letting go of the resentment that had been festering inside me since I first discovered the truth. One evening, about 6 months after everything had come to light, Karen and I were sitting on the porch watching the sunset. It was a quiet moment, one that reminded me of the early years of our marriage, before life got so complicated. We hadn't fully healed yet, but we were getting there. "I'm proud of you," I said, breaking the comfortable silence. Karen looked over at me, surprised. "Why?" "For facing your past. For dealing with everything head on, even when it was hard. It's not easy to do that." She smiled, her eyes filled with gratitude. "I'm proud of you too, for staying, for giving us a second chance." I reached over and took her hand in mine, squeezing it gently. "We're getting there, one step at a time." She nodded, her smile soft and genuine. One step at a time. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in shades of orange and pink, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. Life hadn't turned out the way I had expected, but in some strange way, maybe that was okay. We were moving forward, not just as a couple, but as a family that had grown in ways I never could have imagined. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours, and that was enough.